There's a specific moment you might recognize. You're in the middle of explaining something that matters to you, and halfway through the sentence, you watch the other person's eyes change. Not in a cruel way, just distant. A small flicker, like they're already 3 steps ahead, waiting for you to land the plane. They nod. They say, "That makes sense." But you already know they didn't get it, not really. And instead of trying again, you do something quieter. You just stop. You say, "Yeah, never mind," or "It's not a big deal." And you fold the rest of the explanation back into yourself like a letter you decided not to send. The words still fully formed somewhere inside you, just never spoken out loud. You smile, maybe. You change the subject. Maybe you even ask them how their day was, redirecting all that unspent meaning into something safer. And the strange part is, nobody in the room notices anything happened at all, because to them, nothing did. The conversation just moved on, smooth and unremarkable. But to you, something just closed. A door you used to leave open, just a little, in case someone walked through it. If you've done this enough times, in enough rooms, with enough people who loved you in their own way, but never quite saw you, you already know what this video is about. You're not broken. You're not antisocial. You're not too much or too closed off. You just did the math, somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to. The way you learn certain things not by being taught them, but by living them enough times that they stop feeling like lessons and start feeling like facts. And the math told you something that's hard to undo once you've learned it. Here's the part that doesn't add up, though. The people who reach this place, the place where they stop expecting to be understood, are very often the ones who were the most expressive once, the most open, the ones who used to talk for hours about what they felt, who used to believe that if they just explained it clearly enough, slowly enough, with the right words in the right order, someone would finally see it the way they did. That capacity to feel deeply, to notice nuance, to sense the 3 layers underneath a simple conversation, that's not a flaw. That's a kind of perceptiveness most people don't have, the kind that lets you catch the tremor underneath someone's "I'm fine," or notice the half-second pause before a yes that means no. It should be a gift, and in a way, it still is. But here's the price nobody warns you about. The more precisely you can see your own inner world, the more painfully obvious it becomes when someone else can't. You're not comparing yourself to people who feel less. You're comparing yourself to the gap between what you meant and what landed, measuring it with an accuracy most people don't even know exists. And that gap, when you're sensitive enough to measure it exactly every single time, starts to feel less like bad luck and more like a verdict repeated so often that it begins to sound like a law of nature rather than a pattern of circumstance. So if this kind of depth was supposed to connect you to people, why did it end up isolating you instead? Why does the very thing that makes you perceptive also seem to guarantee that you'll keep being misread, as if the gift came wired with its own quiet penalty? Part of this answer lives in biology, long before any specific memory does. Some nervous systems are simply built with a lower threshold, what researchers sometimes call high sensory and emotional sensitivity, a trait found in a meaningful percentage of the population, and not something rare or pathological at all. Imagine 2 people standing in the same room. One person's brain registers the temperature, the lighting, the tone of voice, the tension in someone's jaw, and the slight delay before someone answers a question all at once, automatically, without trying, the way some people register sound and others register color first. The other person registers almost none of it, simply because their system wasn't built to flag it as important.
Neither is wrong, but the first person is now carrying 5 times the information with no extra room to put it, no extra hours in the day to process all of it before the next wave arrives. That's not a personality quirk, and it's certainly not a weakness to be trained out. That's a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do, just in a world that wasn't built to slow down for it. But biology only loads the gun. Experience usually pulls the trigger. Picture a child, maybe 7 or 8, who comes home and tries to explain something that upset them, something layered and specific, the kind of thing that took courage to even bring to the surface, and gets met with, "You're overreacting," or "It's not that big a deal," or simply a parent who's too tired, too overwhelmed by their own life to follow the thread all the way to where the child needed them to follow it. It doesn't take cruelty to teach this lesson. It barely takes neglect. It just takes enough repetition, enough ordinary, forgivable, human moments of someone being too distracted to fully arrive. Enough times of reaching out with something real and getting back something flat, something polite, something that technically counts as a response, but never actually meets the thing that was offered. Each one of those moments is small on its own, almost forgettable, like a single drop of water landing on stone. But children are remarkably good at pattern recognition, even when they can't name what they're recognizing yet, even when the adults around them would be horrified to learn what conclusion was quietly forming. And the pattern they extract isn't "this one person didn't understand me," it's something colder and more permanent. Being understood is not something I should expect from anyone, ever, no matter how clearly I explain myself. That's not a conclusion a child reaches through one wound. It's a conclusion they reach the way stone gets shaped, drop by drop, year by year, until what's left isn't damage exactly, it's architecture. A structure built to survive in a world that kept proving the same point over and over, until stopping the expecting felt less like giving up and more like finally getting smart, finally seeing clearly what everyone else seemed too naive to notice. Once you understand where this comes from, you start noticing it isn't just one habit, it's a whole architecture, and it shows up in almost every corner of daily life, often in ways that look like personality traits instead of what they really are. The first sign is what you could call preemptive self-editing. This is the internal habit of shortening your own thoughts before anyone even responds, because some part of you has already run the simulation and decided it isn't worth the full version. Psychologically, this resembles a defense mechanism called anticipatory withdrawal, where the brain protects you from a predicted rejection by partially rejecting yourself first. Think of the moment you start typing a long message explaining how you actually feel about something, and halfway through you delete it and replace it with, "Lol, it's fine, don't worry about it." Nobody told you to do that. You just knew with a strange and tired certainty how the longer version would land, and decided the shorter one would hurt less. The emotional consequence is a particular kind of loneliness, the kind that exists even when you're constantly talking to people, because you're managing what gets said more than you're actually saying it. And once you've practiced this enough times, something else starts happening almost automatically. You start translating yourself before anyone even asks you to. This is the second sign, and it goes a layer deeper than editing, because now you're not just shortening your thoughts, you're converting them into a version you think other people can actually metabolize. Imagine sitting in a meeting where a decision feels obviously wrong to you for 3 or 4 interconnected reasons, but when you speak, you only offer the one reason that sounds the most normal out loud. The other reasons, the real ones, stay in a drawer you've learned to keep shut in front of others. This isn't dishonesty, it's a survival skill that turned into a permanent translation layer between your inner world and your outer voice. And the cost of running that translation constantly is exhaustion that doesn't look like exhaustion from the outside, because you still seem articulate, still seem fine. You're just doing twice the work everyone else is doing simply to be heard at a fraction of your actual signal. From there, a third sign tends to surface, which is the quiet death of follow-up questions. You stop asking, "Do you actually understand what I mean?" Not because you don't care anymore, but because you already know what tends to happen when you ask. Either the other person says yes too quickly in a way that tells you they don't, or they ask you to repeat yourself, and something in you would rather absorb the loneliness of not being understood than relive the small humiliation of trying again and failing in real time. There's a name for this pattern in psychology: learned helplessness. Except here, it isn't about your own actions failing, it's about communication itself starting to feel like an action that doesn't work no matter how well you perform it. And once communication itself starts to feel unreliable, the fourth sign appears as a natural next step. You begin over-explaining to strangers and under-explaining to the people closest to you.
This sounds backwards until you really sit with it. A stranger on a forum, someone you'll never have to sit across from at dinner, gets the full paragraph, the nuance, the careful caveats. But your own partner, your closest friend, your own mother, gets 3 words in a shrug. It isn't that you trust strangers more, it's that the stakes of being misunderstood by someone you love are unbearable in a way that being misunderstood by a stranger simply isn't. With strangers, there's nothing left to lose. With the people closest to you, you've already lost it once, and some part of you isn't willing to feel that particular loss again. That fear of repeating an old loss leads naturally into the 5th sign, which is a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that looks like strength from the outside, but often functions as a quiet wound. You become the person everyone comes to for advice, the steady one, the one who has it together, while almost never bringing your own struggles to anyone else's table. Picture the friend who spends 2 hours helping someone untangle a relationship problem, offering insight and patience, and then when asked, "How are you doing though?" answers with, "Oh, I'm good, just tired," and means none of it. This isn't generosity in the simple sense. It's a deeply ingrained belief that your own needs are a burden, formed by enough experiences where bringing those needs forward resulted in disappointment instead of support. Once you believe your needs are a burden, the 6th sign starts to make a strange kind of sense. You begin to feel more at ease around people who barely know you than people who supposedly know you well. The people who've known you for years often carry an outdated version of you in their heads, and correcting that version, again and again, costs more energy than simply letting a stranger meet the real one for an hour and then walk away. The emotional cost here is subtle but corrosive. You start to feel like a guest in your own long-term relationships, polite, careful, slightly performing, even with people who would say, if asked, that they love you completely. That sense of being a permanent guest deepens into the 7th sign, which is the habit of testing people quietly instead of asking them directly. You drop a small, almost disposable version of something important, a half-joke about a real feeling, a passing comment about something that actually hurts, and then you watch closely to see if anyone picks it up. If they do, something in you softens, just slightly. If they don't, you file it away as more evidence, and you never bring up the real version at all. This isn't manipulation. It's a survival strategy born from too many direct attempts that didn't go anywhere, so now the indirect version feels safer, even though it almost guarantees you'll keep collecting more proof of the very thing you're afraid of. And by the time all 6 previous signs have repeated themselves enough times, the 8th and final sign settles in like a kind of internal weather, a persistent, low-grade belief that you are in some fundamental way too complicated to be loved easily. Not unlovable, just complicated enough that loving you correctly would require a level of effort you don't believe people are willing to give. This belief rarely gets said out loud. It just quietly shapes which relationships you let get close and which ones you keep at a careful, comfortable distance, where being misunderstood costs less because you never let anyone close enough to truly understand you in the first place. Here's what almost nobody explains about this stage, though, and it's the part that changes everything once you see it clearly. This isn't just a series of disappointing experiences anymore. It's become a closed loop, one that your own mind is now helping to maintain, without your permission and without your awareness. Because once you stop expecting to be understood, you also, quietly, stop giving people the information they would need to understand you. You withhold the context. You skip the explanation. You let misunderstandings stand uncorrected, because correcting them feels like exposing yourself to a risk you've already decided isn't worth taking. And then, when the other person inevitably misreads you because you've left them with nothing to read correctly, your mind doesn't register that as, "I didn't share enough." It registers it as, "See, I was right. Nobody understands me anyway." The very protection you built to keep yourself safe has become the engine that keeps proving your original wound correct over and over with no outside input required. This is what psychologists sometimes describe as a self-fulfilling prophecy loop, and it's particularly cruel because it doesn't feel like self-sabotage from the inside. It feels like wisdom. It feels like finally being realistic, finally seeing people clearly, finally protecting your own energy from a world that already proved it wasn't safe. The long-term consequence is a kind of solitude that has nothing to do with how many people are actually around you. You can be in a loving marriage, surrounded by old friends, constantly invited places, and still carry a private certainty that none of them have ever met the real version of you because you stopped introducing that version a long time ago. The tragedy isn't that you weren't understood once. The tragedy is that the bracing against being misunderstood again has slowly become indistinguishable from the original wound itself, so that even people who would have tried, who would have stayed, who would have gotten it eventually if you'd given them the chance, never got the chance at all.
But here's where this story can turn, gently, without asking you to become someone else. Because if this entire pattern was built by repetition, drop by drop, it can also be unbuilt the same way. Not through some dramatic act of vulnerability you're not ready for. Just through small, deliberate exceptions to a rule your nervous system wrote a long time ago, when it was trying to survive a much smaller and much less safe version of your life. The first shift isn't about changing who you talk to. It's about changing how you interpret the moments when someone doesn't immediately understand you. Right now, a blank look or a slightly off response probably registers instantly, almost before you've consciously noticed it, as confirmation. See, this is what always happens. This is the proof I've been collecting all along. But not understanding in the moment is not the same thing as being incapable of understanding eventually. Most people are not bad at empathy. They're bad at instant translation of complex inner worlds they've never had access to before. The same way you'd be bad at reading a language you'd never studied, no matter how much you genuinely wanted to understand the sentence in front of you. Giving someone a second sentence, a different angle, a little more context, isn't proof that the first attempt failed. It's just what communication with depth actually requires, even from people who care about you deeply. Even from people who would stay if they only knew there was more to wait for. The second shift is about your response, not your defenses. Instead of automatically shrinking what you were about to say the moment you sense hesitation in someone's face, try staying with the sentence for 3 more seconds than feels comfortable. 3 seconds that will feel disproportionately long, almost unbearable the first few times you try it. Not performing vulnerability, not forcing a breakthrough conversation, not turning every interaction into a test of someone's character, just resisting the urge to retreat the instant it gets slightly uncomfortable, the instant their face does something you've learned to read as a warning sign. Most of the disconnection in your life didn't happen because people rejected the real version of you. It happened because the real version got pulled back before anyone had the chance to respond to it at all, withdrawn so quickly and so quietly that the people around you never even knew there was something to respond to. The third principle is about boundaries, but a very specific kind. Not boundaries that wall everyone out equally, the kind you've probably already built without meaning to, the kind that protect you so thoroughly that almost nothing gets through anymore, the good and the bad alike. Boundaries that distinguish between people who've actually earned distance through repeated carelessness, through real and demonstrated indifference, and people who simply haven't been given a real chance yet, who are standing on the other side of a door they don't even know is closed. This means choosing 1 or 2 people, not everyone, not strangers on the internet, not a whole audience you'll never have to sit across from at breakfast, and deliberately giving them slightly more of the unedited version than feels safe, not because they're guaranteed to get it right on the first try, because you deserve evidence, real and current evidence, gathered after this pattern started shaping your life, instead of evidence frozen in time from a childhood that already ended, in a house you don't live in anymore, with people who may have changed more than you've given them credit for. Maybe you'll always feel things a little more precisely than the room around you can immediately hold. Maybe that part of you was never the problem to begin with, just a kind of perception that arrived early in a world that hadn't learned how to meet it yet, in rooms that were too busy, too tired, too distracted by their own survival to slow down and look closely enough. The version of you that learned to stop expecting understanding wasn't weak. She was paying close attention to a pattern that for a long time was actually true enough times in a row that believing anything else would have felt like denial rather than hope. But patterns aren't prophecies. They're just the most accurate map you had access to at the time you drew it, drawn by a much younger version of you with much less information than you have now. And maps can be redrawn, not by erasing the old roads, not by pretending the difficult terrain was never there, but by walking a few new ones long enough that they start to count too, that they start to feel as real and as trustworthy as the roads you've walked 1,000 times already. You don't have to perform a different personality to be reachable. You don't have to become loud or easy or simple to deserve to be understood. You just have to leave the door open a little more often than feels instinctive for the people who've actually shown they're willing to walk through it, even slowly, even imperfectly. The loneliest thing was never being complicated. It was believing that complicated and unlovable had to mean the same thing. If any part of this felt like it was describing you a little too precisely, you're probably not the only one watching who felt that. Sometimes the most healing thing isn't a conversation with someone who already understands you. It's simply knowing you're not the only one who stopped expecting to be understood, and you're still here anyway. If this resonated, you might already know someone who needs to feel a little less alone in this tonight. And if you want, just leave one word below that describes what you usually do instead of explaining yourself. You might be surprised how many people answer the exact same way you would.